All right, ready to dive deep into the Wars of the Roses. Family feuds, power struggles, you name it. We're really diving into drama this time.
Enough drama to make Shakespeare blush.
Exactly. And we're going to be using this awesome YouTube video you all sent in featuring an Italian history professor, Franco Cardini, and a bunch of other historians. Should be a fascinating deep dive.
It's packed with great insights. This video really goes beyond just like battles and dates, It digs deeper into what really motivated all those players back then. What were their personalities like?
Yeah, so it starts by comparing the Wars of the Roses to what came before it, the Hundred Years' War.
Right, right.
And Professor Cardini makes this really interesting point. He says that the Hundred Years' War wasn't actually just, England versus France.
Yeah, it wasn't as straightforward as we might think, right?
Yep.
Like just two countries going eye to head. Professor Cardini, he really highlights that it was more like, a family feud within French royalty. And the Plantagenets, well, they were ruling England at the time, and they got caught in the middle.
Oh, wow.
And as you can imagine, over a century of war really took its toll on England.
Yeah, exhausted doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, think about it, the economic drain alone, and then the social upheaval. It's like the perfect recipe for a new conflict.
Absolutely. And that's precisely where the Wars of the Roses come in. The video explains that those two main players, the Lancasters and the Yorks, they were offshoots of the Plantagenets. Both of them were vying for the throne.
Red Rose versus White Rose, right? It's like that family feud that just went, completely epic.
Absolutely. It all starts with King Henry VI, a Lancaster. He's kind of portrayed as, well, not the strongest ruler.
Oh, okay.
And the Duke of York sees this and he's like, hey, you know what? I think I could do a much better job, especially after all the chaos from the Hundred Years' War.
Right, so it's not just about, like, bloodlines or whatever. It's more like who would be the best fit to actually rule.
It's about leadership.
Yeah, like a medieval job interview, but with incredibly high stakes.
Right, and the video mentions that the Yorks were, more militarily savvy.
Uh-huh.
They really understood how warfare was changing. The Lancasters, they kind of relied on those more traditional power structures. But the Yorks, they were masters of war. They took mercenary armies and turned them into these like well-oiled fighting machines.
Oh, wow.
And that difference really set the stage for all the conflicts that followed.
So it was like the old guard versus the new kids on the block.
Yeah, exactly.
Each with their own strategies for power. Now, this is where things get really interesting. The video starts comparing the Wars of the Roses to Shakespeare's plays.
Particularly Richard III.
Yeah, Richard III. And Shakespeare, well, he really villainized Richard, right?
Oh, he certainly did. But we have to remember, Shakespeare was writing over a century later, during the Tudor reign.
Right.
And the historians in the video, they argue that the Richard III we see in the play, the one who's all, hunchbacked and tyrannical, he's pretty heavily influenced by Tudor propaganda.
So are you saying that Shakespeare's version of Richard III might not be the most accurate? Like, was it all just Tudor spin?
Exactly. The video really digs into how Shakespeare was probably echoing certain Tudor talking points. Like, for example, they really emphasized Richard's supposed physical deformities.
Right.
Because they saw that as a sign of, inner wickedness.
Uh-huh.
And that played right into the whole Tudor narrative. They were the ones restoring order and virtue after all that chaos and tyranny.
Wow, talk about controlling the narrative. I mean, it really makes you wonder how much of history is actually just filtered through someone else's agenda.
That's a big takeaway from this deep dive, for sure. We have to be careful about what we read and hear about history, always thinking about who's telling the story and why they might be telling it that way. But the video goes on to challenge some other common perceptions of Richard III. Now, he did imprison his nephews, those young heirs to the throne.
Right.
But the historians argue that we need to understand his actions, within the context of his time.
Oh, okay, so they're saying that back then, imprisoning your rivals wasn't necessarily all that unusual.
Yeah, essentially. They point out that being king in the medieval period was, well, a pretty brutal game. Getting rid of potential rivals, even if they were children, was sadly pretty common. Now, the video isn't condoning Richard's actions, but it does encourage us to think about, how morality was viewed back then. It was complicated.
Right, so maybe Richard III wasn't a saint, but he wasn't necessarily a monster either. Just a product of his time, playing by the rules of a very different game.
Exactly. And this brings up a fascinating question. What if the Yorks had actually stayed in power? Would England have gone in a completely different direction?
Wow, that is a thought-provoking question. What kind of England could have emerged under the Yorks?
Well, the video offers some pretty compelling speculation. The historians suggest that the Yorks, because they were so focused on military strength and practical economics, they might have created a more outward-looking, even an expansionist England.
Oh, wow.
They might have been all about continental alliances and military campaigns, maybe even challenged the growing power of France.
So instead of being that, island nation focused on naval power, which is what happened under the Tudors, we might have seen a more land-based continental power.
Precisely. It's a really fascinating what-if that the video brings to life. But Edward IV's victory was pretty short-lived. A decision that was driven by love ended up plunging England back into chaos.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. What did Edward IV do that shook things up so dramatically?
Well, despite a lot of advice against it, he fell head over heels and ended up marrying Elizabeth Woodville. She was a commoner, and on top of that, the widow of a Lancastrian supporter.
Oh, wow.
This marriage, it caused quite a scandal. It was seen as politically unwise, and it alienated some of Edward IV's most powerful allies.
Like who?
Well, like the infamous Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker.
The Kingmaker. Now, that's a nickname that needs some explaining. Who was this guy?
Warwick was basically the ultimate power broker. He had immense wealth, commanded this huge army, and was a master at manipulating, political alliances. He was actually the one who helped Edward IV rise to power in the first place. And he was not happy about being sidelined by this unexpected marriage.
Oh, wow. So Edward IV basically turned his back on the very person who made him king. That's a bold move, to say the least.
It was a move straight from the heart, not from, political strategy. And as the video explains, it created a huge power vacuum. And of course, others, including Warwick, were more than happy to fill it.
This is getting good. So what happens when you portray the Kingmaker? I have a feeling this isn't going to end well for Edward IV.
You're right to be suspicious. Warwick, well, he felt slighted, and he saw an opportunity. So he orchestrated this stunning reversal of fortune, teamed up with, guess who? Margaret of Anjou, the woman he'd been fighting against.
Wow, that's a plot twist.
Right. Together, they planned to put Henry VI back on the throne.
Oh, wow, the enemy, my enemy is my friend, right? It's incredible how quickly those alliances can shift in these power struggles. So what happened to Edward IV? Was he able to hold on to his crown?
Not at first. Warwick's cunning, combined with Margaret of Anjou's, fierce determination, they were a force to be reckoned with. Edward IV was forced to flee into exile in Burgundy, and Henry VI, the king who'd been deposed, made a brief return to the throne.
So the Lancasters are back in power, but I have a feeling this isn't the end of the story. Edward IV seems like the kind of guy who would fight tooth and nail to get back what he lost.
You're reading the story well. Edward IV, with the help of his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, raised an army and sailed back to England. He was ready to reclaim his throne.
Now, this is where things get really Shakespearean, isn't it? Betrayal, shifting alliances, exiled kings seeking revenge. It's all here. What happens next in this epic power struggle?
Well, to really understand what happens next, we need to delve into the character of Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He's often portrayed as a villain in popular culture.
Right, especially thanks to Shakespeare.
Exactly.
Yes, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He's the one who becomes Richard III, right? The king Shakespeare made out to be a hunchbacked tyrant. I'm really curious to see what this video reveals about him.
Let's peel back those layers of myth and propaganda and see what we can learn about the real Richard, Duke of Gloucester. His role in the Wars of the Roses is crucial, and this video gives us a fascinating look into his motivations and actions.
Okay, let's dive in. This is going to be good. Okay, so let's talk Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He comes across as a pretty complex figure in this video, like someone trapped in this cutthroat world of medieval politics. It makes me think, how often do we oversimplify historical figures? Like we just sort of categorize them as heroes or villains.
That's such a good point. History is rarely black and white, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Richard was a talented military leader, fiercely loyal to Edward IV.
Right.
And, well, incredibly ambitious. This video does a good job, I think, of showing us a more balanced view of him. Moving beyond just the caricature that Shakespeare gave us.
It seems like Shakespeare really had it out for Richard. Was that all because of that Tudor propaganda you mentioned?
Exactly. Remember, he was writing during the time of Queen Elizabeth I, a Tudor, right?
Right.
And the Tudors, well, it was in their best interest to make the York look bad.
Right.
So Shakespeare's Richard III, all hunched over, scheming, well, he was the perfect contrast to the, virtuous image that the Tudors wanted to project.
Yeah, it's almost like a historical PR campaign shaping how people saw the past to, give their rule more legitimacy. But the historians in the video, they seem to be saying that Richard III wasn't actually the monster Shakespeare made him out to be.
They argue that while Richard, he made some ruthless choices, those actions weren't really out of the ordinary for the time. Medieval politics, it was a dangerous game.
Yeah.
And getting rid of your rivals, even potential ones, that was a pretty standard strategy.
Wow. So what were some of the specific things that Richard III did that gave him that bad reputation?
Right.
You mentioned him imprisoning his nephews, those boys who were the rightful heirs. What's the story there?
Well, after Edward IV died, his young son, Edward V, he was supposed to become king.
Right.
But Richard, being Edward's uncle, he was made Lord Protector.
Uh-huh.
So Richard was in charge, but shortly after, he declared both Edward V and his brother illegitimate
Oh, wow.
and had them confined to the Tower of London. And that's where the mystery starts because, well, the boys just vanished.
Vanished? Wait, what happened to them?
Well, that's one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in English history. The video goes over some of the theories and debates about the princes in the tower, but honestly, there's no proof of what really happened.
Wow, a missing king, a power-hungry uncle, all these rumors of foul play. It sounds like a historical thriller.
Right.
It really does.
And that mystery, it's fueled centuries of speculation. Richard III's enemies accused him of murdering those princes, but honestly, like the video says, we might never really know for sure. It's a case that keeps historians and anyone who loves history totally fascinated.
So with his nephews out of the way, Richard III took the throne for himself.
He did. He was crowned King Richard III in 1483. And the video makes this interesting point. His reign, even though it was short, had some good things going for it. Legal reforms, support for trade, he even strengthened the Navy.
So maybe he wasn't a completely terrible king. Sounds like there was more to his rule than just ambition and, backstabbing.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting, right? It challenges those simple ideas we have about Richard III just being, a villain. The video shows us he was a capable ruler.
Right.
But his reign was always overshadowed by those missing princes. And all those whispers of foul play, they followed him everywhere.
It seems like even if he had been a decent king, all that suspicion and doubt, it must have made it really hard to actually rule effectively. Did anyone try to challenge his claim to the throne?
Well, that's when Henry Tudor enters the scene. He was a descendant of the Lancastrian line, right?
Right.
And he saw Richard's vulnerability as his chance to take the throne for himself.
Wait a minute, Henry Tudor. Isn't that the guy who becomes Henry VII, the one who starts the Tudor dynasty?
That's the one. He was living in exile in France, just biding his time. And he started gathering support from people who were against Richard I, even some Yorkists who had turned against Richard.
Uh-huh.
The video really highlights how strategic Henry Tudor was, how good he was at using that growing dissatisfaction with Richard's rule to his advantage.
So now we've got Richard III, the Yorkist king, with all this controversy surrounding him, facing off against Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian who wants to take back what he sees as his. It's setting up to be quite the showdown.
Oh, it definitely was. And the video takes us to 1485, the Battle of Bosworth Field. It's the big clash that ended the Wars of the Roses, and honestly, it changed the entire course of English history.
Wow. Okay, paint me a picture. What was Bosworth Field like?
Okay, imagine a muddy battlefield. Leicestershire, right?
Okay.
Two armies staring each other down, the fate of England hanging in the balance. Richard III, a seasoned warrior leading his Yorkist forces.
Right.
And opposite him, Henry Tudor and his Lancastrian army, all of them wanting to reclaim the power they lost.
Oh, wow. I can just imagine the tension. So who wins this epic battle?
The battle was fierce, no doubt. But things really shifted when a couple of Richard III's key allies, they switched sides.
Oh, wow.
They joined Henry Tudor. And Richard III, he fought bravely, but he was killed in battle.
So Richard III dies on the battlefield and Henry Tudor becomes king. That's how the Tudor dynasty gets its start.
Exactly. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. And to solidify his power even more, you know what he did? He married Elizabeth of York,
Oh, wow.
daughter Edward IV. It was this symbolic ending to the Wars of the Roses, bringing those warring houses of York and Lancaster together.
It's amazing to think that a single battle can completely rewrite history. Henry Tudor goes from being this exiled nobody to, the founder of one of England's most important dynasties. It makes you wonder, what if Richard III had won that day? How would things have been different?
Yeah, those what-if moments are what make history so fascinating. This video does such a great job of showing us that history isn't just, a straight line of events that had to happen. It's the result of choices, of luck, and of the personalities of everyone involved.
This deep dive has been amazing. Battles, betrayals, dynasties rising and falling, it's all here. And the video doesn't just focus on the big picture stuff, it also looks at those more subtle ways the Wars of the Roses have shaped how we understand history.
You're getting it. The video explores how the Tudors, because they were so focused on securing their power, well, they really crafted the story of the Wars of the Roses. They wanted people to see them as the saviors.
Right.
The ones who restored order, so they painted the Yorks as the villains,
Uh-huh.
and the Lancasters as the rightful kings.
So they took control of the story to make their rule seem more legitimate. It's like a historical PR campaign, spinning things to benefit them.
Exactly. And it's important to understand how long-lasting that kind of manipulation of history can be. Even now, how we understand the Wars of the Roses is still colored by the Tudor perspective, especially through Shakespeare's plays. They really reinforce those ideas.
It's incredible, how things that happened centuries ago can still affect how we see the world. This deep dive has really shown me how complex and nuanced history truly is.
And that's one of the key takeaways here.
Yeah,
This video encourages us to be critical thinkers,
right.
to question historical narratives and understand the biases and motivations of the people who create them.
Well, this video has definitely made me want to learn more about the Wars of the Roses. I'm really fascinated by Margaret of Anjou. She seems like an amazing woman. I think I need to find a good biography about her.
That's a great idea. I encourage you to really explore this period, read different accounts, look at the debates historians have, and come to your own conclusions. You might be surprised by what you find.
This video covered so much. We talked about Shakespeare's interpretations, Richard III's complicated legacy, and even that surprising link to New York City.
You're right, there's a ton to unpack here, and this video does a fantastic job of tying all these different threads together. It shows us how events from the past are still relevant today, how they shape our view of history, and even our own identities.
Okay, let's dive into those other fascinating details. I'm ready for more. All right, let's talk more about those intriguing details you mentioned, like the Yorks. The video argues that even though they lost in the end, they still had this big impact on England.
Definitely, and they propose this really interesting what-if scenario. What if the Yorks had actually stayed in power? Would England have gone in a totally different direction?
Really? How so? I mean, we always hear about, the glorious Tudor era. What could have been so different if the Yorks had been in charge?
Well, the historians suggest that because the Yorks were so big on, military power and practical economic policies, they might have created an England that was much more outward-looking, maybe even expansionist.
So instead of focusing on a strong navy and exploring the New World, like what happened with the Tudors, they might have tried to expand their power on the European continent.
Exactly. They might have formed alliances with continental powers, got involved in more land-based military campaigns, maybe even gone head-to-head with France.
Wow, that's a completely different picture of England than what we're used to. It makes you wonder, some of those stereotypes we have about British history, like being reserved or having an island mentality, would those have been different if the Yorks had stayed in power?
That's a great point. It shows how history can really shape a nation's identity.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of shaping identity, the video also brings up this surprising connection between the Yorks and, well, New York City.
Wait, what? New York City. I know it was named after the Duke of York, who later became King James II, but how does that go back to, the Yorks from the Wars of the Roses?
Yeah, you're right about the Duke of York connection. But the city wasn't always New York. The Dutch founded it, called it New Amsterdam.
Right.
But when the English took over the colony in 1664, they changed the name to New York to honor the Duke of York.
Uh-huh.
He played a big role in the conquest.
Ah, so even though it's a few generations after the Wars of the Roses, that York legacy is still there in the name. It's cool how these little echoes of history can pop up in the most unexpected places.
It really is. And if you think about it, the name New York has all these associations with the Yorks. Their ambition, their military strength, their whole role in English history.
Right.
It's like a constant reminder that the past is still shaping our present, even in these small ways.
This deep dive has been incredible. We went from medieval battlefields to the founding of New York City. And this video has really made us think about how history gets written, and how those stories we tell can influence how we understand the past.
It's been a really exciting exploration of the Wars of the Roses. What makes this video so great is that it doesn't try to simplify things. It doesn't shy away from the complicated parts of history.
Yeah.
Like, it raises questions about whether Richard III was truly a villain. It talks about alternative versions of history, and it reminds us that history is rarely simple or straightforward.
It's definitely made me rethink some things I thought I knew about this period, and it leaves us with these really interesting questions to think about. Like, what if the Yorks had actually won? How would England's place in the world be different? Would we see Richard III as a tyrant or as a strong and effective king?
Those are great questions to consider. And that's the beauty of history, right? It keeps us curious, makes us question things, and pushes us to look for new perspectives.
This deep dive has definitely sparked my interest to learn more. I think I'm going to go find that biography of Margaret of Anjou now.
Oh, I'd love to hear what you think. And for everyone listening, I encourage you to keep digging deeper into the Wars of the Roses. Write those primary sources. Form your own opinions. You might be surprised by what you discover.
So, what historical mysteries will you uncover next?